Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, Metro columnist, and I'm joined by
City Hall reporter Joshua Fechter
and Josh Brodesky, editorial page editor.
Well, as you all know, we primarily focus on local issues or Texas issues, but there have been some really momentous happenings on the national scene that I think we have to talk about, and they're going to impact Texas politics and local politics over the next year or so. I think technically we'd had an impeachment process that was kind of moving along slowly, and last week things changed dramatically because we got a whistleblower report and a memo of a conversation between President Donald Trump and President Zelensky of Ukraine, July 25th conversation, in which the president, as the whistleblower had alleged, the president asked Zelensky to investigate Joe Biden and his son. Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, was on the board of a Ukraine natural gas company, and I don't think there have been any real allegations of wrongdoing there, but the president was basically asking for help in targeting a political opponent. So Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, has come out in favor of impeachment. She was reluctant prior to this. You had, I think the number is maybe about 230 Democrats who are at least in favor of the process going forward. And so this is this is really serious now. And I wanted to get a chance to talk to you all a little bit about the politics of this, and I think that there's some Texas political figures that I'd be curious to kind of bring into this. But Josh, when you look at the politics of this, I mean, Nancy Pelosi was worried about it because I think the memory that people have is 1998. Republicans sort of overplayed their hand. They impeached Bill Clinton over lying about a sexual relationship, and it hurt them politically in the 1988 midterms. And I think that Nancy Pelosi had the concern that that there would be some kind of backlash about this. I think she's changed her view on it, mainly because I think she now thinks we've got to do this. When you look at the politics of this, I mean, what's your sense about it?
Well, it's like you look 2 years later. I think this is a weird thing that people don't think about enough, is that 2 years later, in that instance, in the Clinton impeachment instance, you get a Republican president. Like I've for whatever reason, like any analysis of sort of the politics of it, that kind of falls by the wayside.
That's a good point.
But obviously, like Pelosi's concern was that all of these moderate Dems were going to be endangered if they pursued this. A lot of the calls for impeachment were coming from the more progressive wing of the party, and now a lot of those moderate Dems are flipping. They're going, okay, let's go ahead and take a look at this. And that's giving her that sort of insulation.
Josh Brodesky, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't think Nancy Pelosi had much of a choice in terms of what was alleged and what we know from the whistleblower's complaint. And, of course, the concerns raised by the aforementioned moderate Democrats. The writers of the Washington Post op-ed, all 7 of them have national security backgrounds, and so they were looking at this strictly from a national security concern. And I think, if you were to take the personalities out of the situation, I don't see how it couldn't be investigated, right? How an inquiry couldn't be open. So, it's whether or not it's popular with voters at this present moment sort of strikes me as somewhat irrelevant given the gravity of the situation, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that, I've heard from readers on this issue over the last few days. I mean, one is, that the Senate is not going to remove Trump from office. I mean, there's probably a fraction of 1% chance that they would do so. And I think we'd have to get a lot more evidence of wrongdoing to persuade a serious number of Republicans to do that. And so I'll hear from readers saying, well, he's not going to get thrown out of office anymore, so this is kind of pointless. Or they'll bring up the polling on it. One thing that I didn't know until I read something about this last week, I thought was pretty interesting, that in the early days of the Nixon impeachment process, the support for impeachment was like around 19%, and over a period of about a year grew to 50%. Already we're seeing there's been some pretty rapid shift on this just over the last week or two. So I think there is some salesmanship involved in trying to make the case to the American public that this is serious. But Josh Brodesky, as you were saying, I mean, I think Pelosi was left with the choice of do we strictly look at the politics of this, or do we look at what kind of precedent we're setting?
Right. I mean, when you think about the rough transcript, and for those who are listening, I just put that in air quotes, right? So the rough
Visual
transcript,
medium.
that's the cleaned up version of the discussion, where there are some pretty jarring things said by the president in terms of inviting an investigation into Joe Biden. That's the cleaned up version. We still don't know what the actual official transcript says. We don't know Congress hasn't had a chance to subpoena or hear testimony from people who had heard these conversations. There are any number of questions that still need to be answered, which is why I don't think you can ignore the possibility of an inquiry. But whether or not, I mean, I think it's a foregone conclusion at this point that the Senate won't convict, but we don't even know if the House will move forward with official impeachment. I mean, so much of this actually hinges on those moderate Democrats with the national security background, and so as long as I don't think any of us should get out over our skis in terms of thinking what might happen, but to ignore it, that would be a very unsettling precedent, right?
And again, with Watergate, I mean, really, no one knew where the process was going to lead. It's like we need to have a process.
Right.
This demands that we have a serious process, but nobody really knew where it was going to lead. And I think that we should be open to the idea that this is the same kind of thing. I think now everyone sort of wants sort of a predetermined outcome, and where is this going to lead us? And if it doesn't lead where we want it to go, then we shouldn't do it. But I think that, as you said, I mean, the process itself, I think, is that's the point.
Right, and we also don't know about, there are other conversations that have apparently been handled in a very secretive way, so we don't know about those conversations. There's just a lot that needs to be opened up, and as far as the politics goes, I mean, it'd be better if we all didn't look at this in terms of through like a strictly political angle and polling and whatnot, but actually looked at it in terms of the substance of the allegations and what they might mean for the country. But I don't know how Democrats who have a co-equal branch of government, they have control of a co-equal branch of government, I don't know how Democrats could look at these allegations and turn around to their base, regardless of what the polling says, and say, hey, this doesn't justify it. And I think we could all agree that if things were flipped around, Republicans would be doing the same thing on a Democratic president.
I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Yeah, and I wonder how it affects the outcome of the Democratic primary. Obviously, you've got Joe Biden leading the pack, and you have, even though there's not any reporting that's substantiating these allegations, even the appearance of impropriety can damage a candidate. And I wonder to what extent, I'm going to make kind of like a rough analogy, like, on Twitter, around the time that Brett Kavanaugh was being confirmed for the Supreme Court, you saw a lot of conservatives say, look, if you want to have these allegations about Brett Kavanaugh, progressives, you also have to throw Bill Clinton under the bus. And a lot of what you saw in that conversation was progressives saying, yeah, let's throw him out. And so I wonder to what extent you have that same sort of dynamic where progressives who are going through this primary process see this as sort of like an excuse to get Biden out of the way.
Well, I think there might be, even though, as I said, I mean, Hunter Biden, I mean, it's been well documented. He's had a lot of problems in his own personal life, but there really was no criminal investigation into him that needed to be shut down. This is I mean, there to my knowledge, there's really no there.
Right.
But at the same time, we all know how politics works, and the fact that Hunter Biden is being dragged into this, and questions are being raised about Joe Biden, which I think I don't think there's anything to that, but obviously, if you're in a perfect world, if you're involved in the Democratic Party, you'd like to have a nominee who wouldn't have any of this stuff floating around.
Yeah, but I also think that, I mean, while we have yet to see any substantiation of those allegations against Joe Biden, the idea that the vice president's son would make $50,000 a month on this Ukrainian,
that's right,
natural gas company on its board. He has no expertise in this topic. I think that's the kind of thing that many voters just glom onto, and they say, what is this? You know, this
That's
is not
right.
how the world works for the rest of us, and it's a very it's a very tangible, kind of meaty issue that, and obviously this happens in the world of politics, you know, with across,
Right.
you know, the whole political spectrum, where people who are connected to people in power end up in, you know, in places that create wealth, and it's a real problem. So
It is, and I think that one of the arguments that I've heard, you know, people who've been involved in Democratic campaigns make when it comes to how do we run against Trump. One of the kind of a slogan that I've heard thrown out there is like, you know, he works for himself. He's not working for us. And they point to examples of members of his family who have seem to be benefiting financially from having him in the White House, and the fact that he's financially benefiting from, you know, foreign leaders coming and staying at his hotels and so on. So I think that argument, which is a valid argument to make against Trump, just the broad argument that he's kind of, that in everything he does, he's in it for himself. I think that argument does get weakened by having, you know, what you pointed to with Joe Biden and the fact that Hunter Biden seems to have benefited financially from having his dad as vice president. So I think that is an interesting point to look at. I wanted to shift to the issue of Will Hurd, who is going to be, I think, an interesting voice in this process. He's someone who has an intelligence background, worked in the CIA. He's a Republican who is not running for re-election. He's been pretty critical of Trump, though he's voted with him on many things. He disagreed with him on the border wall and on the separation of families at the border. And he seems open, at least, to having this investigated. Last week, he was at the Texas Tribune's Trib Fest, and during a discussion, he was asked about his future plans and suggested that he's open to the possibility of running for president in 2024. And I wanted to get your thoughts because, I mean, I think that there's he's looking at it, and we'd have to have a different Republican Party in 2024 than what we're looking at now. I mean, what scenario, Josh Brodesky, do you see as one that would allow for a candidate like Will Hurd?
Oh gosh, I mean, I guess it's hard to imagine. I mean, I think very highly of Will, and if he's listening to this, or it doesn't matter if he's listening to this, I think very highly of Will. It's hard to imagine a scenario where Will could really credibly run for president in 2024. But certainly the Republican Party would need to have a demoralizing defeat in 2020, it seems like, and then sort of go through a sort of Trumpism purge. That I feel like so many Republicans maybe are caught in this nexus where they sort of have to pay lip service to Trump policies because they're really concerned about being primaried, with the base. So I guess for starters, you need a Democrat in the White House and probably Democratic control of at least the House, going forward.
It would almost be like Joe Straus running for governor of Texas. I mean, that kind of thing. You're basically someone who you're going to have to get through a primary process. A Will Hurd or someone like him, I think would actually be a pretty appealing general election candidate for president. But to get through that primary process would be so difficult.
And he's going to be he'll be in the mix somewhat, but it's different. He'll be out of office, and it's a long time between 2020 and 2024. Just like you mentioned, Straus, he's not House Speaker any longer.
That's right.
He's lost that platform.
But you kind of have to look at the way he's behaving now as sort of an indicator basically how he would run now. I mean, he's out there on the impeachment inquiry. He's saying, look, we need to look into these allegations, but it's way too soon to tell whether there's any there, and whether this actually requires a full impeachment. So you kind of have him striking that balance where it's like, okay, he's trying to strike out as sort of like an independent sort of CIA type with that intelligence background, saying we do need to look into this, but also like he's not trying to antagonize that Trump base to some extent.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting is like last week you had Jeff Flake, the former senator from Arizona, who was a Republican one of the strongest Republican critics of Trump, and probably decided not to seek re-election because he was wondering about his own place in the party. And he said that something that I think many of us have heard, that when you get congressional Republicans behind closed doors, they're really critical of the president, and they speak about him very differently than they do in public. And I think someone, Mike McCarthy, who is a former Republican consultant who worked for John McCain and Mitt Romney, said that he had heard from a senator that if you had a secret ballot, you'd get 30 Republican senators to vote to remove Trump from office. And I think it was Jeff Flake that came back and said, "No, you're wrong. It's 35." So it's now that I think what I'm getting at is the point that if Trump has a horrible loss in 2020, and who knows what will happen, but if that happened, I think you're going to have a lot of Republican elected officials who are very quickly going to pivot and say, something along the lines of, "We never liked the guy in the first place," or something like that. Or I think they're going to you can't come out and say it that way, but I think they're going to sort of distance themselves from him as much as possible. Now the hard thing is that he has a lot of support among Republican voters out there, and that's not going to necessarily go away.
No, it's not. I think, it's interesting that you bring up Flake, because I think that's sort of it's an apt parallel in some ways to Hurd's position in the party. Obviously Hurd has defended his seat, and he's done quite well there, even though he's not going to run again. But you look at Flake, who he decided not to run for re-election, and then the person who ultimately won his seat was Kristen Sinema, a Democrat. And so it sort of speaks to this. I mean, there's nothing rhino about Jeff Flake. Jeff Flake's as conservative as they come.
Right.
He's very much almost like in the libertarian mode. But it's just, when you're a critic of the president and you don't align with the president's policies in this environment, there's just no place for you right now.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, Will Hurd is a conservative, I think, by most definitions, but maybe our 2019 definition doesn't fit with that.
Yeah, I just wonder, to what extent the Republican Party does rebrand after, say, Trump does suffer a pretty devastating loss in 2020. Like, what actual sort of introspection is there going to be? Because, I think of Mitt Romney in 2012, where they came out after that election. They said, we need to court a way more diverse coalition. Afterward, there was a lot of sort of soul searching.
We need to reach Latino voters, which there was
And I wonder to what extent they would do that after 2020, because after 2012 they turned to Trump.
And I think that the lesson of that, and it was just a reminder that the leadership of a party really they just don't have the control that they may want to have. I mean, they wanted to come out of 2012 and say, we're going to do a lot more Latino outreach and speak to Latino voters in a way that's maybe be more compassionate on the issue of immigration. And then they ended up nominating someone who was advocating a border wall, but he obviously wasn't the choice of the party leadership. They just didn't have control over it. And so that's what we don't know. That's if the Republican voters would come out of a Trump defeat thinking, okay, we need to move in a new direction, or would they just be really angry that he lost and continue to support, his cause?
Well, yeah, and let's be clear. I mean, Trump very easily could win re-election.
That's right.
Which would reaffirm those policies. So, right. I mean, I don't view 2020 remotely as a foregone conclusion.
Not at all. Not
very
at all.
much. I would actually be surprised if he loses in some ways.
Yeah.
But I think, what Trump demonstrates is that there isn't that appetite among the Republican base for somebody who is packaged like a Mitt Romney or maybe even a Will Hurd, somebody who is, maybe more traditional Republican, even if they have, pretty much the same policies.
We've seen in the past, when we went through the Reagan era sort of realignment of politics, where a lot of, sort of Southern moderate, Democrats started to feel like, I don't know if I fit in anymore. The Sam Nunns and people like that. I don't know how I fit. I think we're seeing it now with people like Will Hurd and maybe Jeff Flake, and it's just, it could take several years for all this to really, shake out. On a different topic, I wanted to revisit something we talked about it a little bit last week. It was breaking news when we did the podcast last week. The raid on the office of Constable Michelle Barrientos Vela, who has had, there have been a lot of questions about her conduct in office. And what's happened in the last week is, I think it was during that Monday when she did when she was talking to the press, she essentially announced that she wanted to run for sheriff. And
while they were doing the raid.
And she, she over the months leading up to this, she had hinted that she might run for sheriff. And then I think she had announced that she was going to seek re-election for constable. So she announced that she was going to run for sheriff. The state constitution has a provision that says that if you're a county official and you announce for another office, you have to resign the position you're holding. On Wednesday, Nelson Wolff had a press conference and said, as far as we're concerned, she's gone. We're going to find a replacement. And she's now saying that it was not a formal announcement, but an excited utterance, and because she was, quote, in a frame of shock over the raid, and responded. Josh Brodesky, help us make sense of this.
Well, I think she gave county officials a way to remove her from office, and she made her statement clear. There's clear intent behind it. There's precedent in Bexar County, and there's another case that we know of in Harris County where this has happened. Whether she spoke out of turn or not, it's sort of irrelevant. I mean, she's made it. She said that she's going to run for sheriff, and so it's tricky because our county officials obviously using these statements to, clearly they are, but she said what she said, and you can't take that back. I guess, she hasn't filed yet, right? She hasn't done anything like that.
No treasurer's report or anything,
Yeah, but she's made her statements clear. So their appointments, they're going to make an appointment this week, and life's going to go forward. I guess she could litigate this just to some degree, but if she plans to run for the sheriff's position, she probably should just move forward with that.
Yeah, and probably shouldn't have said she was going to if she hadn't really thought it out.
It was interesting that Nelson Wolff said, you know what, if the state constitution didn't make it so that we had to have constables, we'd get rid of constables.
Yeah.
Well, and it'd be nice to get rid of constables, I think, for urban areas at least. One of the questions that we've had on the editorial board is what purpose do these offices really serve, and why couldn't deputies, sheriff's deputies, just fill this role?
Yeah, I think they could, and as we've seen, there's just been a history, particularly in recent years, where these constables, they get elected, and then they just start thinking that they have a lot of power that they don't, and they start kind of running amok, and so, I think some of the abuses that we've seen with her, like, charging people for security at a, at a park, and that kind of stuff. These are unique to her, but I think there have been other cases where we've seen people in that constable position thinking that they're, I was just astounded when she was talking about, these criminal investigations that she was conducting, that, she complained that the agents were going through her files, and I'm prosecuting these cases. And I'm just thinking, like, when did we reach the point where a county constable thought of themselves as someone who was prosecuting these important cases?
They're just, my understanding is they're mostly just serving paperwork.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's definitely an unforced error on her part, but I can't fault county officials for making the most of it.
Last topic before we wrap this up, I wanted looking at another county race on Saturday. Gethin Rodriguez, who formerly ran the county's Veteran Service Office, announced that she's going to run for county commissioner. This is the second time in 2 years that she's done this. I think it was almost the 2-year anniversary of her first announcement, and at the same location. And it's going to be a very different race, though, because 2 years ago she was running against Paul Elizondo, who had held the seat for 30 plus years, and so it was kind of a generational change argument that he's been there so long, and that we haven't seen a lot of change in the community, particularly on the west side, and now she's seeking to replace Gethin Rodriguez, who is former state rep, who got the appointment when Paul Elizondo passed away at the end of last year. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on. I mean, there's no question that she's she's a formidable challenger, and she got 48% of the vote against Paul Elizondo and pushed him in a way that I don't think we had seen in a Democratic primary here. But I mean, how tough is this going to be for her to take on Gethin Rodriguez here?
Well, I wonder about, just in terms of the name recognition. I mean, she got within 4 points of Paul Elizondo. I don't know what, because Gethin Rodriguez is also starting out with, a significant fundraising advantage. So
that's right. That's going to be big.
I think if she's running against Justin, it's going to be a very high bar, because of the fundraising advantage, because of his high name recognition. He strikes me as very popular in the county. Paul Elizondo, people had strong feelings about Paul one way or the other.
Right.
I think she's a very talented and engaging candidate. So much of this probably depends on whether or not Nelson Wolff runs for re-election as county judge, because there's a lot of scuttlebutt or chatter about, well, then maybe Justin would run for county judge because his name ID and popularity
he would
is
seem
that
like the
high.
most natural person among the other county commissioners right now.
Exactly. So then you have an open seat, and then, it very much looks like Gethin's to lose at that point, in my view.
It's also interesting because there are people that support her who had thought maybe she'll run for Shirley Gonzalez's District 5 council seat, because Shirley Gonzalez is term limited out in 2021. So it would be a matter of like waiting a year, basically. And I think Gethin Rodriguez would have gone in there. I mean, I'm sure several people will run, but she would have been in a pretty good position there. And so she's kind of taking the more difficult path.
She's taking a more difficult path, but also, it's, if she takes it, it'll be, there'll be much more, instant gratification there. I mean, it'll be, she'll have, but one of the things that I wonder about is because, her narrative is that she came back and kind of like saw the West Side in its current
serving
state.
in the Marines. Yeah.
And, county doesn't have as much power to control that. I mean, if you were to run as sort of a change agent, theoretically, running for Shirley Gonzalez's seat would actually grant you sort of more power to shape that side of the city.
Yeah, very interesting race. We're going to be following that. I think we're out of time. We're gonna leave it there. And Josh Brodesky, thank you so much for joining us. It was great having you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Right, we'll catch up with you next week. Take care.